Buddy, welcome to the Wednesday, April 15th lecture in Media and Politics. I hope everybody's doing well. I am currently recording this on Tuesday from my very cold and cloudy backyard, and I'm trying something a little new for the first time since all this started, which is recording a lecture while my kids are present. So if you hear the voice of a 4-year-old in the background or even in the foreground as he comes up to ask me a question, then that's Andrew. And if you hear a less coherent voice, that's Patrick, who turned 2 this past weekend, and they are currently playing right in front of me. So we will give this a shot, as I'm sure many of you are dealing with similar situations where you're trying to juggle work and school and kids and everything else. So I figure, why not jump in the boat with you? So we're going to keep talking about social media today, in particular Facebook. We covered basically the New Yorker article on Facebook that was assigned for the week. We covered that on Monday. And today we're going to be covering the 2 Wired articles, which kind of get at Facebook's experiences kind of right after the Trump election and into 2017 and 2018. And then we'll sort of render a verdict on a situation that's obviously still very fluid and still ongoing, which is how has Facebook done in responding to the challenges that living in this age of misinformation has posed. And not only how have they done in responding to the challenges, but how complicit have they been in creating some of these challenges in the first place, right? So also there's a very active mockingbird, I think, like literally on the power line right above my house. So you guys are getting the full experience of my backyard today. All right. So we left off here last time, and we asked this question, which is how does a social media company like Facebook grapple with some of the most foundational aspects, not only of our experiences online, but just of human nature in general, right? Like, what is truth? What does truth mean? Is it the job of a technology company to try to ascertain or push versions of the truth? What is free speech is another question, right? This is something that traditionally in American public spaces has fallen to the purview of federal judges to tell us what their definition of speech is. But even judges don't always fully have a handle on what is free speech and what's not. And then how does that sort of play into speech on the website of a company like Facebook, right? What are the limits of free speech? What is Facebook's role in promoting political violence, right? How complicit are they in allowing, in a sort of a best case scenario, disinformation to spread, and in a worst case scenario, actually violence-inducing speech? And then finally, we'll circle back to this question, right? Which is, should Facebook be the arbiter, the decider, the sort of Merriam-Webster's dictionary of truth for its 2.2 billion members, which, if you remember from our lecture on Monday, Facebook has more members than Christianity has adherents, right? So its reach is truly global. There is no corner of the earth, except in countries where it's banned, where it does not touch society and politics in some way. So we talked a little bit of history, not only the history of how Facebook was started, but with my own history as well. And so I want to jump forward in this timeline a little bit to 2012, which was, of course, the year that Barack Obama was reelected. Facebook had reached a plateau in its growth. I don't know if you remember the charts from Monday, but obviously Facebook saw its largest sort of increase of users. That was primarily driven by young people who were early adopters to the site, obviously in 2004, kind of 2004 through 2008. And then 2009, 10, 11, 12, it was older people who were signed up. And by 2012, there was the sense among tech journalists and the tech industry that Facebook had kind of plateaued. It had reached everybody that it was going to reach, and there were only so many things it could do to increase its market share. They had to adapt. And they did so in a couple of ways. So they tweaked their newsfeed to fully incorporate actual events and actual news, not just personal news, right? So not so and so's kid got baptized today, but this person was elected president today. And also, I don't know how aware of y'all of this that y'all are, but um, it wasn't until 2006, I think it was 2006, maybe 2007, that Facebook even adopted the newsfeed in the first place. Before you had to click on a friend's profile in order to see any changes that they had made to the information that they listed. So by the end of 2013, by incorporating news into the news feed, actual news, traffic had doubled to news sites, and Twitter had begun to decline. By 2015, Facebook actually surpassed Google as the leader on the internet in referring readers to publishing sites. So, for example, the New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, etc. In that same year, Facebook launched what they called instant articles, which is where publishers could work with Facebook to actually post articles directly to Facebook rather than simply linking to their own content. And the way that they dealt with instant articles had a lot of ramifications and something that we're going to get into tonight. But what it basically put them in the business of doing was they went from being simply a clearinghouse for information to actually being in the news creation business. So with their entry into the news creation business, they tried to come up with some rules, right? And some were easier than others. So obviously, they wanted to ban pornography. They wanted to protect people's copyrights, and that stuff's pretty, obviously kind of self-explanatory. Although in the case of pornography, it can get a little tricky. But everybody was in agreement that yes, these things are okay to ban, right? But while they were focusing on these sort of practical solutions for these problems, they didn't really think of these big eternal questions that have not only bedeviled journalism for years, decades, centuries, but also really of human nature, right? So what is fair? What is a fact? What are the trade-offs between civility and privacy, right? If you give people ways to keep their data secret, then that by definition can create zones of incivility, right? Where content moderators can't reach. And so these are, again, questions that journalism has been dealing with for a long time. But journalists have always been in the news creation business, right? And it's a little bit less clear what Facebook's role in all of this is, right? How also, when you're in the business of news creation, do you signal to audiences the difference between news, between analysis, between satire, and opinion? And what's interesting is Facebook made a very distinctive choice when they were trying to decide how to be in the news creation business. And it was very specifically to never favor one kind of news content over another. And if this seems like a pretty innocuous choice, just know that it's not, right? So, for example, nightly news broadcasts don't give equal opportunity to neo-Nazis and mainstream Republican and Democratic candidates to espouse their views, right? They make an editorial decision that this is not needed for the marketplace. And that is a decision that they make, right? And also, by the way, this is why so many fringe groups find platforms like Facebook appealing, whereas they have for a long time been very frustrated with the gatekeeping aspects of the mainstream media. On Facebook, there is not as much of a gatekeeping aspect, although there is more now than before, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But as a result, every piece of content on Facebook appears in roughly the same way. So, for example, investigations that are well reported in the Washington Post, gossip columns that appeared in the New York Post, or completely made up stories, as some researchers found from a newspaper that literally does not exist called the Denver Guardian. And all of these things are presented roughly the same way, right? They look the same on the newsfeed when you are scrolling past. This is something we've talked about in class, right? If you wanted to recreate a physical copy of the New York Times in your dorm room, it would be very apparent to anyone immediately what an amateur job you will have had to have done, right? You just simply do not have the expertise, you don't have the staff, you don't have everything to make a publication like the New York Times possible. from your dorm room. On the other hand, if you have an internet connection and a Facebook account, you can post an article on Facebook, share it widely, and it will look roughly the same using instant articles that an article from one of these mainstream outlets will have. Again, this does have a democratizing effect on the spread of information, but the opposite is true as well, which is you tend to lose some of the standards that mainstream media has spent a long time perfecting. So let's get back to the relationship between publishers and Facebook, right? So as Facebook started putting more and more quote unquote news, like real news articles into the news feed, publishers knew that this was going to have a really big effect on how traffic was being driven to their websites. And frankly, the relationship between publishers, mainstream media outlets, and Facebook has always been a rocky one. Publishers, for example, and this is a metaphor that the articles use, but I think it's a pretty apt one. Publishers know that they are simply sharecroppers on Facebook's massive industrial farm. And of course, as Bob Dylan sang about in Maggie's Farm, he who owns the farm has all of the leverage. And if Facebook wanted to, it could harm publishers by manipulating its traffic, its ad network, or its readers. So in February 2016, a Facebook employee asked in an internal memo, what responsibility does Facebook have to help prevent President Trump in 2017? And this set off a battle inside of the team that ran trending topics, which is what showed up on the side. Twitter, of course, still has this feature. Facebook may, I'm not sure. But the people who moderated trending topics acted essentially as gatekeepers as to what people on the site saw. And this internal question was publicized, and conservatives from the American right leaped onto this finding and essentially accused Facebook of censorship. And this would be the first time that this happened, but not the last. So if you know Alex Jones and InfoWars, it's another example of this. But as a result, because they were under fire from the American right about censorship, and of course Washington is a town that's mostly run by conservatives, Facebook simply refused to implement any standards about truthfulness. And the fact of the matter is, both parties employ political spin, but one party, at least in our modern era, has tended to stretch the truth more than the other. And I really liked this quote from a Facebook investor in late 2015 and early 2016. So when he was finding stuff on the site that seemed problematic, he said, "I'm observing memes ostensibly coming out of a Facebook group associated with the Bernie Sanders campaign that could not possibly have been from the Sanders campaign. And yet they were organized and they were spreading in such a way that suggested somebody had a budget." And I'm sitting here thinking at the time, that's really weird. I mean, that's not good. And of course, he's talking about the rise of fake news, spread not only by teenagers trying to earn money from Facebook ads, sitting in their parents' living rooms in Macedonia, versus some very well-funded and sophisticated trolling operations emanating from Moscow and St. Petersburg in Russia. So nevertheless, there were some conditions that essentially were ripe for fake news to take hold on Facebook during this time. For one thing, they were very afraid of political favoritism, right? And when one side is promoting disinformation more than another, even if you simply are not showing favoritism, but you are trying to correct that disinformation, it's an asymmetrical relationship, right? If you're constantly correcting false information from the Republican side, that then gives Republicans ammunition to say, well, how come you're not doing it to the same degree to the Democrats? And of course, the underlying assumption is that both parties are being equally truthful or equally untruthful. And I think that the research would show that that is simply not the case right now. But nevertheless, these are the conditions that Facebook was under at the time. For a while, they no longer do this, but Facebook sold ads on fake news stories. And of course, sensational garbage, just as car chases on local TV, or cable news rather, are good at pulling people into the platform. These disinformation stories were good as well. Facebook also had some perverse incentives to cleaning up fake news because their executives have bonuses that are tied to growth and to revenue targets, and incentives are aligned for growth, not truth, right? And if sensational, garbage, clickbaity news is drawing more and more users to the site, they're spending longer on the site, Facebook can sell more ads, they can make more money, their execs get paid more, right? And they were also dealing with the 1996 Communications Decency Act, specifically Section 230, which we don't have time to get into at the moment, but it essentially was something else that Facebook was having to deal with as a content creator. So, of course, we know what happened in the 2016 election. We know how important Facebook was to the Trump campaign strategy. And the election, I think, really stunned Facebook in a lot of ways. And Mark Zuckerberg, immediately after the election, gave this quote, which is sort of infamous now, but he said the idea that fake news on Facebook, of which it's a very small amount of the content, influenced the election in any way, he says, I think is a pretty crazy idea. And we'll come back to this quote in a minute, but as a result of the criticism that was levied against Facebook in the wake of the election, they cut off advertising revenue for ad farms. They made it easier for users to flag false stories. They introduced fact-checking, and they took a number of steps. As the months after Trump's election progressed, Facebook ran its own internal investigations. Frankly, it took them a long time, one might say too long, to find evidence of Russian propaganda on the website, which many computer security analysts said was hiding in plain sight all the time, right? And they were accused of actually not looking that hard. For example, an outside researcher found that there had been 500 posts from 6 different Russian-funded groups that paid in some low 6 figures for the ads, which is not that much money by Facebook standards, but these posts were shared by Americans more than 340 million times. They targeted, for example, Black Democrats. They tried to get Black Democrats to vote for Jill Stein by running stories about Hillary Clinton. They tried to sow discord between whites and Muslims in Texas, even leading to a real-world sort of standoff, not even a standoff, but a rally for people against the spread of Islam in Texas. And this was encouraged. In fact, it was originally thought of and promoted by the Russian government. So it was not long after Trump's election, in fact, a year after Trump's election, in the wake of trying to figure out what happened with Russia, that Congress first held hearings on the misinformation sowed by Russia and what role Facebook may have played in that. And of course, later they would ask what question the Trump campaign played in that as well. And the sort of money quote from those hearings came from Dianne Feinstein, the Democratic senator from California, who told Facebook, "You've created these platforms, and now they're being misused, and you have to be the ones to do something about it, or we will." Implicitly saying to Facebook, we are threatening you, you better clean up your act. If you don't self-regulate, we will regulate you. And Mark Zuckerberg, for his part, said, "I've expressed how upset I am that the Russians tried to use our tools to sow mistrust." He said, "We build these tools to help people connect with each other and to bring us closer together, and they use them to try to undermine our values. And what they did is wrong, and we are simply not going to stand for it. Protecting our community is more important than maximizing our profits." So in the current era, Facebook has made some changes. For example, instant articles, they allowed publishers to paywall instant articles to require readers to subscribe. It seemed to have become sort of common knowledge that paying for serious publications has really become a path forward for journalism in a way of resisting this post-truth political landscape that we're in. I liked this quote from one of the Wired pieces too. It said, "If we just reward content based on raw clicks and engagement, we might actually see content that is increasingly sensationalist, clickbaity, polarizing, and divisive. A social network that rewards only clicks and not subscriptions is like a dating service that encourages one-night stands, but not marriage." Facebook has also, even despite claims of political favoritism, started boosting certain publishers, ones whose content they consider to be trustworthy, informative, and local. Yet, of course, this is difficult, right? Because it goes back to these foundational questions which we posed not only on Monday, but at the beginning of today's lecture as well, which is what is trustworthiness and what is news, and whose job is it to determine what these are? Well, Facebook, in their quantitative sort of way, tried to get at this. So they used surveys of its own users to get people's impressions about different publishers. And as for news, they made the determination that stories involving politics, crime, or tragedy tend to be news. Why only these three categories? Obviously, these are news categories, right? Politics, crime, and tragedy, those are all newsworthy things, but people would argue maybe that they are, of course, not the only newsworthy topics either. I'd be remiss if I didn't spend a little bit of time before we circle back to the current era talking about Cambridge Analytica, which was the firm that Ted Cruz used in his 2016 presidential campaign and that Trump used also in his 2016 presidential campaign after Cruz dropped out. Um, you are maybe familiar with Cambridge Analytica. They've been in the news. They were in the news quite a bit during the Trump impeachment hearings. But in 2014, an academic from the University of Cambridge in the UK built a personality questionnaire app that, in the true spirit of Facebook, convinced a lot of people to give up a lot of personal information for free. That essentially gave him the access to the data of 87 million people. And this Cambridge academic then sold that data to Cambridge Analytica, who used it to help Ted Cruz's presidential campaign and eventually the Trump campaign too. But first, after Facebook realized what had happened, they demanded deletion of the data. The company didn't listen. They worked with the Trump campaign after Cruz dropped out. And this sparked an enormous amount of outrage. And ironically, this outrage during 2018 in particular was directed at Facebook via the very news ecosystem that Facebook had helped to create, right? So their algorithms had helped to sustain a news ecosystem that prioritized outrage. And then that news ecosystem was learning to direct outrage at Facebook itself, right? So it's like building a robot who has one sort of weakness, and then eventually that weakness turns on the robot itself. That's maybe a weird metaphor, but it is what it is. So Zuckerberg was asked to testify in person in front of Congress in April of 2018, so a couple of years ago, to get at some of these questions. So by the end of 2018, there were 30,000 people at Facebook who were working on safety and security issues. This is roughly the same as the number of newsroom employees in the entire United States. Facebook has 15,000 content reviewers who work at 20 giant review factories around the world. The instructions for moderating hate speech are 200 pages long. These moderators undergo 80 hours of training before they can start, and it's a really tough job. They're watching videos and content that other users on the site have flagged, in addition to going over what has been flagged by Facebook's own artificial intelligence software. And so they're watching a lot of tough things. They're watching people live stream suicides. They're watching child abuse. They're watching pornography. They're watching, in some cases, murders. And research has shown that these content moderators suffer from PTSD. Some who are in charge of flagging information that are related to conspiracy theories have actually become conspiracy theorists themselves because they're inundated with these messages all day long. So it's a very, very hard job. So the verdict is that Facebook has tried really hard, although some would say very unsuccessfully, to overcome its original sin. And its original sin was the assertion that Mark Zuckerberg claimed the platform was built on, which is that if you just give people better tools for sharing information, then the world will be a better place. And the journalists for Wired say that this is false, right? Sometimes Facebook makes the world more open and connected, sure. Sometimes it makes it more closed and disconnected and disaffected. And like the communications innovations before it, right, the printing press, the telephone, the internet itself, Facebook is a revolutionary tool. But human nature, of course, has stayed the same, right? And so this tool is, of course, only as good or as bad as its users. And this is something that Facebook has to deal with and it's something that they'll always have to deal with. And my 2-year-old Patrick just wandered over to say hello, and he found a screw on the ground, which he just handed me. You can't have that, buddy. It's gonna be bad. You can't have it. Do you want to say hi? Say hi. Hi. Yeah, now my 4-year-old wants to say hi too. This is Andrew. Andrew, say hi to my students.
Hi.
You want to tell them anything exciting? Come closer so they can hear you.
We went on an Easter egg hunt.
He says we went on an Easter egg hunt. That's very true. Did you find some Easter eggs?
And we got birthday cake.
And you got birthday cake? Because whose birthday was it?
Patrick's.
That's right. It was your little brother's birthday. Well, is there anything else you want to tell my students before they sign off?
That's it.
That's it. All right, guys. Well, that's it on our end. I hope that all of you are staying safe and doing well under the circumstances. And please reach out if you need anything at all. I know that registration has opened up, so if you want to talk about that, don't hesitate to hit me up over email, and we can find a time to talk on the phone or Zoom or whatever you want to do. But in the meantime, stay safe, and I'll talk to you next week.